So, a slight pivot, but I think you address this in the book as well. On this show, when we interview entrepreneurs and operators, one of the questions we always ask is how they view the importance of their team and company culture to their overall mission and objectives. So I'd love to kind of hear your take and advice on that particular issue.
Yeah, it's so important, and we do in the human ocean. We talk about first of all your early employees and what they look like and what should be expected of them, and it's we kind of see two different ends of the spectrum. We see companies that as they start to scale, they go out and they hire the rainmaker, right? The salesperson who had great success with one other startup or one other technology company, and it costs them $250,000 a year and some equity, but that person's going to revolutionize the business, and that almost never happens. So putting kind of all your eggs in one basket. But the other end of the spectrum are those enthusiastic but perhaps naive founders who say, hey, I'll just get a bunch of interns from the local university, and I can get 5 for $30,000 a year, who are fresh out of school and energetic and smart, and they'll pick it up. Well, not having any experience and having a lot of resources that are less capable and also perhaps less adaptable to wearing different hats early in their careers can be a similar kind of burden. So having that balance of experience and capabilities that you're willing to invest in and pay for, with some energy and enthusiasm and some less perhaps skilled or experienced folks, having that balance of resources and not overpaying is a very delicate one for startups. But we have a specific Detberg called the crazed culture Detberg. And the example we use actually comes from a local, very successful tech startup, but they went through the roller coaster that a lot of startups do in their early years, and they had this gong, and every time they set this kind of culture up where we're going to celebrate success, and every time they made a sale, the salesperson would get to ring the gong. Well, as they grew, other functions started saying, hey, how come the salespeople are the only ones who get to ring the gong? We should do that if we have like successful uptake on our marketing campaign, and that drives more inbound traffic, or for our product developers who are working late nights. So all of a sudden it became, okay, so these are the categories of things that are gong worthy. So let's offer that opportunity. So all of a sudden the gong's going off, like every 15 minutes for somebody. And eventually the salespeople were like, because they're like the coolest kids on the block, right? And they were like, we're not going to ring the gong anymore because it's not like special. So you guys go ahead, knock yourselves out. And the company and the economy kind of went into a little bit of a tailspin. So all of a sudden, instead of every 15 minutes, the gong was like eerily silent, maybe once or twice a week. So kind of adapting your culture over time, similar challenges, which I think would resonate with founders who have been through a scalable, where they set up this practice of going out to lunch on the birthday of, employee number 5. And that works great until you're at employee number 250 and you're spending, almost every day going out to lunch with an employee. So being cognizant of the culture that you're creating, but also being aware that will change, perhaps subtly, but change in not the core values of that culture, but in how they manifest, how you actually exercise the key aspects of your culture, and recognize that those specific practices and tools to reinforce the culture are going to need to grow with the organization over time and with different economic circumstances, et cetera.
I think sometimes one of the challenges we see is that people think culture is emergent. We don't have to decide what we're going to do. We'll just get a bunch of people in the room, let them do stuff, and then we'll see what works, and then we'll all move forward together, right? Well, that also doesn't work. And so you really want to be mindful of where do we want this to grow to, and what's important to us within this. Our mission and vision are the terms we often use, but that everybody can kind of get around, and then ask, well, what processes do we need in order to ensure that? Like, how would this look if this is what we said we wanted to be? And I think that you're seeing a lot of that even in this crisis, right? So there's lots of different ways to think about how you deal, particularly if you're in a non-essential business right now, with your employees, right? So you could fire them all and they go get unemployment, right? But if you are actually a benevolent company and you think of your employees as your family, there's a message you're sending when you just axe them all, right? And so then, well, do you give them severance? Well, how's that going to work? So do you furlough them, right? So furlough typically means you're not paying them, but they stay on with health benefits. Well, again, does that fit with what you promised and what you think you ought to do? Or do you keep them on and you try and find business loans to cover it and the tax write-offs and hope for stimulus, right? So 3 really different ways of dealing through this crisis. And it should come back to your culture versus, one executive I was talking to just was like, well, we're going to pick the cheapest way for us. I'm like, whoa. Like, before this, there was a talent shortage. Cheapest way for you is maybe not the first criteria you should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think I love what you were saying about not just assuming culture will be emergent. And I was thinking that exact thing after kind of listening to your overall advice, that it's like, yeah, I mean, this takes planning and to be purposeful and mindful about how you do it. And I think that's definitely what I see a lot, is that it's unfortunately a rare entrepreneur who puts time and energy into the planning of that piece of it. I more often see people talk about the importance of it, but I think that there is that underlying latent belief that, oh, because I'm nice and the people I'm working with are nice and we're all gonna be nice together, that it'll just emerge the way we want it to.
Right. And then what happens when it doesn't? And people, look around. Are people friendly? Aren't they friendly? How are they in the office? Aren't they in the office? Right. So you can have lots of different styles depending on what it is you want to accomplish and what, you think is the reason for being there.
And I think importantly, some people neglect to recognize a lot of what culture is formed by is what you choose not to do. And there are always trade-offs that organizations have to make in any kind of strategic choice, but having clear limitations on what you will not do, what you're not willing to do with your key stakeholders, with your customers, products you're not willing to develop or sell, and customers you're willing to say no to because they're either too costly or they're just not a fit with your business model and your value proposition. Those are things that are very defining of a culture as well, and should be made explicit.
When we talk about the team and that impact on the overall achieving the entrepreneur's objectives and the company's objectives, I want to pivot a little bit to talking about specifically co-founders and investors. Your views on kind of and advice on what operators should be thinking about and how they pick their co-founders and their investors.
Yeah, and our first ocean that we talk about is the human ocean, and the founders are the first category, and co-founders. And just to share, one of the biggest mistakes that we see a lot of entrepreneurs make is both to allocate equity, all of the equity early. So 2 co-founders, over a cup of coffee or a beer or something, start a company and split it 50-50. One, splitting 50-50 is a really bad idea. You should have one person that is the primary decision maker at least. And 2, equity should be earned over time commensurate with progress of the venture. So you don't start out by allocating 100% of the equity until you're actually making real progress and who's kind of pulling their weight. So whether you have 2, 3, or more co-founders, again, don't allocate all the equity and have that equity vest over time commensurate with contribution. And that's one of the big mistakes that we see with co-founders.
And I think what happens is people just aren't willing to have the hard conversation. It feels too business-like for friends. And maybe you get an attorney involved, but you need to lay the parameters out. You need to talk about what behavior is acceptable and what behavior isn't acceptable. I mean, we've seen some horror stories where there were multiple co-founders in one state and went bankrupt. A couple of them came here. The third co-founder reached out to everybody in the community with let them know about the failed the bankruptcy back there. And it's like, wow, you all really had a bad conversation. So, get it in writing. I mean, there is a reason that prenups happen for marriages. So, I mean, they feel icky. It's an emotional thing, but actually it's a smart thing. It'll actually make you operate better because you know what the terms of your agreement are.
Another piece of that, and whether you get it through co-founders or through advisors or mentors, is that diversity of perspective. And it's not unusual that co-founders maybe work together, maybe went to school together, maybe from a socio-demographic perspective are very similar to each other. But particularly if you're trying to sell to a market that is outside of your demographic, you certainly want to have either some co-founders or at least strong advisors involved who bring diversity of perspective and experience. That really decreases the chances of you sailing around in a sea of false hope for too long.